A decent, safe, and affordable home is something all Americans need to thrive. For decades, low-income families have struggled to have access to affordable rental homes. But now, this is a huge problem for the middle class too. Millions of middle-income earners can't afford rent in major U.S. cities due to the steep rise in prices recorded since the pandemic. Without significant pay rises or government assistance, these middle-class households are being shut out from typical middle-class neighborhoods, and this is triggering a chain reaction that leads to systemic poverty and lingering inequality. In other words, housing costs are squeezing the life out of middle-class Americans, and today we've compiled several stats and facts that prove so. But before moving on, we kindly ask you to support our work and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our upcoming videos. The American dream used to be that you got married, settled down, purchased a home, and grew old. Today that concept looks a lot different, and buying a home isn't something that everyone can afford to do. In recent years, multiple financial burdens have emerged for everyday Americans, such as increased debt, soaring housing costs, and rampant inflation. Many factors have contributed to the decline in home ownership and the shift towards renting. Today, nearly 43 million families live in rented apartments in America. This is the highest level in history, and the surge in the number of middle-class renters has been staggering. In the past 5 years, the number of households making from $56,000 to $100,000 a year that decided to rent increased by 82%, according to a recent report from the Joint Center for Housing Studies of Harvard University. At the same time, rental vacancy rates are lower than they've been since 1985, and once renters do find housing, they have to pay the price. The typical home now costs about $80,000 more than it did just 2 years ago, and the average rent in the U.S. is over $1,000 more expensive than in 2020. Rents are climbing an average of 3.5% annually, the study found, while middle-class renters' incomes have declined 9% over the past decade. In an interview with ABC, salesman Robert Gary from Columbus, Ohio, says he always lived a comfortable middle-class life until the pandemic changed everything. Now, Gary is seeing his pay raise pale in comparison to the rise in the cost of living. "I'm living paycheck to paycheck and barely making it," he said. "I get a raise, they raise the prices to take my raise away." According to Gary, in December, his landlord informed him that his rent would go from $1,710 a month to $1,950 starting in January 2023. A $240 increase in a month was just insane, stressed Gary. No one cares anymore. Companies are out there taking as much as they can get. When asked if he was able to afford it, the renter lamented, "No, not with the price of everything else right now. I mean, that's half my income," he said. "The only things I could find cheaper than this were in neighborhoods that I wouldn't feel safe in." The pace at which Gary was forced out of his middle-class lifestyle was extremely shocking to him. "It is unlike anything I have seen in my 60 years in America," he emphasized, adding that he now has to move out and stay with a friend until he can find a place he can afford. Unfortunately, similar situations are becoming increasingly common for middle-income renters. In fact, the managing director of the JCHS, Chris Herbert, argues that in 2023, rental housing in America is a tale of two markets. While upper-income renters are finding a healthier supply of housing choices, too many families earning less than $100,000 per year are having to make trade-offs between putting a roof over their heads and food on the table, he said in a statement. In most metropolitan areas across the country, the American middle class has been spending far more on housing than they can afford, researchers found. The study highlights that 21.2% of middle-class homeowners and 46.3% of middle-class renters in the United States are either moderately or severely burdened by housing costs, defined as spending more than 30% or more than 50% of their income on housing, respectively. The property price boom of the past few years has pushed 70% of homes out of reach of first home buyers on middle incomes, especially now at the highest interest rates in over a decade. Those able to buy are having to save for an extra year to have a 20% deposit, the data revealed. Meanwhile, rents are consuming progressively larger shares of income. In Boston, for example, the median rent hit $2,680 in February, up 24% from 3 years ago. A household would need to earn at least $117,000 annually to afford this, based on the standard definition of affordability, in which one should pay no more than 30% of income for housing. Consider that in Boston, an elementary school teacher makes approximately $68,000 a year, and a registered nurse $73,000, and you get the picture that the middle class is getting squeezed. Similar median rents are now the reality in Los Angeles at $3,000 and Washington at $2,600 a month. Demand is fueled by an exploding population of millennials who are buried in student loans, stuck in low-paying jobs, and do not stand a chance in the real estate market right now. Alongside them are baby boomer retirees choosing to downsize to apartments, former homeowners exiting foreclosure, and millions of would-be homeowners who simply can't access mortgages in the tightened credit market. Everyone wants the same locations: cities, transit-friendly suburbs, and town centers that are walkable and close to jobs. However, the pace of new residential construction has been insufficient to make up for the years when it was at a virtual standstill. We're simply not building enough rental housing, affordable or otherwise, in the places that people want to live. In many cities, demand is so great that there are easily enough high-income renters to support prices well out of reach for the middle class, not to mention lower-wage employees and seniors. And we can expect the imbalance between supply and demand to keep rents high for well beyond the short term. Ultimately, we're in a rental affordability crisis, noted Whitney Egud-Opreiche, a research associate with the Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies. Believe it or not, 15 years ago, more than 2/3 of people who rented an apartment or a single-family home in the U.S. earned less than $30,000 a year, the study shows. But beginning in 2010, with the economy still suffering the effects of the subprime mortgage crash, the share of middle-class renters surged. That shift came as the country started to heal from the 2008 housing bust. Along with straining family budgets across the land, the revival of the economy drove up home prices to new record highs. Rents, too, have been rising since the Great Recession. In the coastal and hot cities like Denver and Austin, those increases have put even rentals out of reach for most of the middle class. In 2022, the capital required to sign a lease on the average-priced $3,500 a month apartment in San Francisco to often top $12,000, owing to requirements for first and last month's rent, plus security deposits and a broker fee. In contrast, since 2010, we haven't seen a significant increase in home building that could be made up for the time when it virtually stopped all over the nation. We didn't build anything during the recession. That's still biting us today, said Andre Bueno, the founder of Los Angeles-based real estate investment firm Bueno Group. If you are in the missing middle, you are incredibly out of luck. The missing middle represents those who aren't rich enough to navigate the current housing market without getting burned, and at the same time aren't poor enough to qualify for government assistance on housing. No wonder why U.S. cities are increasingly home to high rollers who can pay the high rents or down payments, and lower-income people who qualify for subsidized housing, while middle-income earners are being priced out of middle-income neighborhoods. Every year that passes by, it gets even harder for middle-class renters who cannot qualify for subsidized housing to find affordable apartments on the market. Renters need to earn $21.21 an hour to afford a modest two-bedroom apartment in the U.S., according to the National Low-Income Housing Council, significantly more than the average national hourly wage of $16.38. This is why 51% of renters in the middle class are unable to afford a place to live in most U.S. cities. The savings that used to be associated with the middle class have dried up in the past few years as wage growth has stagnated. Not only does this make it harder for people to stay in the middle class, but it makes coming up with high sums to rent or buy city apartments impossible. It's very hard to get people to understand that the affordable housing crisis is not for the very poor, explains lawyer Michelle Dickerson of the University of Texas, an expert in housing in the middle class. It's for people with good jobs who are not poor enough to qualify for subsidized housing, nor rich enough to pay the rising housing prices. A family that makes $100,000 can't afford to buy a house in most U.S. cities, Dixon says. Analysts at the University of Texas estimate that in order to comfortably raise a middle-class family, you've probably got to make around $300,000 a year. Thanks to elevated inflation, the middle-class lifestyle is getting harder to obtain due to rising costs of gasoline, food, housing, travel, tuition, and healthcare, they wrote. And even though you can certainly raise a family earning less, statistically most do, it won't be easy if your goal is to save for retirement, save for your child's education, own your own home instead of rent, and actually retire by a reasonable age. In Austin, Texas, preschool teacher Elisha Husman told ABC that managing everyday expenses has never been harder. Living on my own and being a teacher and having my rent and car payment and other bills, by the end of the month it's tight, Husman said. The truth is that spending too much on rent can have far-reaching implications on one's life that go well beyond end-of-the-month stress. Cost-burdened households across the U.S. spend 41% less on food and 74% less on health care, according to a study released by Apartment List. Already, approximately 51 million households don't earn enough to afford a monthly budget. That includes housing, food, childcare, healthcare, transportation, and a cell phone, the study exposed. The majority of people are struggling with their housing, Fannie Mae multifamily research head Kim Betancourt outlines. There's not enough housing for the people at the cost level they should be at. If there aren't enough cheaper options, it becomes a chain, with a middle-class person living in an apartment a lower-income person might have occupied, and so on. Apartment List Senior Research Associate Sydney Bennett said, if you miss that gap in the middle for housing, it has a chain reaction. And the aftermath of that is systemic poverty and an increasingly unequal America, where only those at the very top of the economic chain can own their homes and build equity through properties, while the middle class is hollowed out. This isn't only a housing and rental crisis. This is the reflection of the crumbling foundations of a broken society, and nothing that our leaders are doing is making things any better. The financial meltdown that we're witnessing today is a reminder that more distress is coming for everyday Americans. And sadly, it looks like real estate will be the next domino to fall.